The topic for today is confessional poetry and its main characteristics. Now, what is confessional poetry? To put it in very simple terms, confessional poetry is poetry of self-revelation. It was in the late 1950s and the early 1960s that a group of young poets, including Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton and W.D. Snodgrass, made their entry into American poetry with a very novel and a startlingly novel, I should say, method of writing poetry. The term confessional was first used by the American poet and editor M.L. Rosenthal in his review of Robert Lowell's collection of poems titled Life Studies. The confessional poets chose to write about intensely personal and intimate themes which were hitherto left untouched. Other names too are associated with the school of poetry, namely Allen Ginsberg, Theodore Rothke and Adrian Rich. And critics sometimes feel that the confessional poets were trying to follow the principle of the traditional confession, where the sinner would be free of his transgressions and crimes when he unburdens himself to a listener. But poets like Sylvia Plath have refuted this claim and say that they do not write poetry in order to purge themselves or their feelings. Now let's look at the important features of confessional poetry. The point that should be highlighted when we talk about this particular school of poetry is that it is extremely personal in subject matter. The confessional poets wrote about private experiences about death, trauma, depression and troubled relationships. They were often interested in the psychological aspects of poetry writing and often sought to reveal the poet's anguish or deep emotions. Depression, suicidal tendencies, sexual problems, alcoholism and drug abuse are discussed with an openness, as Rosenthal says, that went beyond customary bounds of reticence or personal embarrassment. While Snodgrass spoke about the trauma of losing a daughter in a painful divorce in his Heart's Needle, John Berryman revealed an adulterous affair he had thought he had gone through in his own life. And these are examples to show the extremity to which intimacy can be taken in confessional poetry. Yet another feature is the autobiographical style that these poets employed. The I in confessional poetry is mostly the poet himself. As Rosenthal observes again, poets like Robert Lowell removed the mask that hid the poet's actual face, and the speaker is unequivocally himself. Anne Sexton, for instance, started writing at the suggestion of a therapist as a means to get rid of her psychological anxiety. Many of Berryman's poems contain elements of his own traumatic experience, including his father's suicide. Another defining feature is the first person narrative. Confessional poetry is often defined as poetry of the personal or poetry of the I, the capital letter I. The poet and the narrator are one and the same, and he or she almost always talks about real life experiences. Therefore, it is most convenient and apt for him to speak in the first person and thereby facilitate an emotional identification with the reader. Now, lyrical craftsmanship is another important point to be noted. Even while dealing with shocking experiences, the confessional poets paid careful attention to prosody and techniques of versification. The poets are not presented in a simple stream of consciousness manner, but are crafted with much care and precision. Though they do not follow any particular universal pattern of rhyme or meter, they are very well crafted. W.D. Snodgrass, for instance, incorporated everything from metaphor to allusion to aphorism in his works. Though confessional poetry was subject to much criticism as dealing less and less with poetry and more with anguish, The writing of many contemporary poets like Sharon Olds, Mary Howe, and Franz Wright still continues to hold spellbound a very large audience. Many readers find that they can easily identify with confessional poetry, probably because it reveals to them that others too share the problems that they experience. They often feel that these poets are lending voice to their own experiences which can never be spoken out loud. Therefore, the genre continues to hold its place in literature.